Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is No Soundbites Allowed, and I am your host, Michael Voss. Dragon of the Southern Tier, I'm happy to be here with you today, May 18th of 2022. It is a Wednesday, and the election season is well underway. It is something that we always take great interest in. Since 2008, we've been covering elections and candidates for you to know who are you voting for and what do they stand for. And in that vein, today we're going to be talking about New York State and the insanity that has been going on there. People who have come back, people who are going away. There's been a lot that's been changing, and we're going to talk about it with you. Before we get started with that, though, we want to mention if this is the first time that you are seeing our channel, we welcome you and we thank you for being part of our audience. We want you to know that we do long-form political commentary, and every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a live stream with you. We reach out on social media to hear from you from anywhere in the world, to receive your tweets, your chats, your phone calls, to tell us what you think about the issues that are affecting us all. And we do that every Sunday because we believe in your First Amendment right. Even if your government doesn't agree, even if the social overlords are upset, we look forward to hearing your voice every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. And we hope we'll see you this Sunday as well. Elections are always a complicated, confusing mess. In fact, in New York State at this time, it is one of the most confused elections that we have seen, at least in the 54 years of my life. We have seen problems that have come because of the bias of the New York State Democratic Party, the single party rule of this state. And when I say that, that's not hyperbole. That's not me exaggerating. That's exactly what was found by a New York State appellate court. As reported from NBC News, and this was on April 27th, New York court rejects new congressional district maps, says primary delay may be needed. They go on to say in the article from NBC, New York's highest court on Wednesday rejected new congressional maps that had been widely seen as favoring Democrats, largely agreeing with Republican voters who argued that the district boundaries were unconstitutionally gerrymandered. Unconstitutional. That's the state of New York. Now, just to make this make sense for everyone, after the 2020 census, New York State redid its congressional lines, as did every state in the nation. But unlike most states throughout the nation, New York State is controlled by a Democratic majority in both the legislature and, of course, the governor's seat. And New York State took the opportunity to use its single-party power to redraw the congressional lines so that they had an unfair, unconstitutional advantage. That is not in question. The courts looked at it and said the same thing that the public said. This is unfair. And so they had to go and redo this. Now, obviously, this made a lot of challenges for candidates who don't know what district they were in. We started the year in January with certain lines in place, and then all those lines had to be changed. In fact, you may recall when we were talking about this in March, when the lines had been changed, and Josh Riley, who had gone from one district, went to another district, as we had reported on back on March 4th, abandoning his hometown to take advantage of the new Democratic lean in the election. But it didn't end there. After the courts made their ruling, well, we had to go back and make new lines. And that new line, those new districts have been determined now. There was a special master release draft, which has been accepted, which will redraw the lines yet again for New York State. This time, though, we will see that there will be 26 House seats. New York State only lost one seat after counting illegal aliens. There are 15 Democratic-leaning congressional seats. 3 leaning Republican, 8 that are competitive, that have no advantage, no overwhelming advantage for either party. This is a big difference. Now, obviously, that makes a problem for some Democrats. Again, like with our friend Josh Riley, he now has to find a new district, having moved for the 3rd time now and now looking to run in the New York 19th district. But we'll address Josh Riley and his race in the near term. The thing that we wanted to address right now is an old friend of the channel. Well, maybe that's a little sarcastic and heavy-handed. Mr. Steve Wells has returned. As reported earlier today by Syracuse.com, a prominent GOP candidate has emerged, shaking up central New York and the race for Congress in the New York 22nd District. This is the 3rd version of the New York 22nd District. Now, to give some context, the New York 22nd District has, over the last 6 years, been one of the top 3 competitive races in the nation and has drawn a great deal of attention. We have been following that very closely, one of the closest in the entire nation. But this is now the newest iteration of the New York 22nd District. In that district, a Mr. Steve Wells is what is being called a prominent GOP candidate by Mark Weiner, the writer of the article. We're going to address that in just one second. Now, you may say, who is Steve Wells? He is the founder of American Food and Vending Corporation, a large corporation in the southern tier central New York. But if you don't deal with food vending, you probably don't know who he is. In fact, most people would have forgotten about him very quickly. As we mentioned in our tweet in response to Mr. Weiner, Steve Wells is not prominent and still virtually unknown even after his failed 2016 primary run. Perhaps that's due to his lack of in-person campaigning, or to help public forget about his donations to Cuomo and allegations of pay to play. Now you may say, well, Mike, what do you mean? What is this all about? Well, the fact is, Steve Wells stopped speaking to the public back on June 29th of 2016 after he lost his bid for the Republican primary for the New York 22nd District, losing to Claudia Tenney. And he lost with 34% of the vote. So most people didn't really know him then, and since that time, no one's had a chance to know anything about him now. But we remember Mr. Steve Wells. And when we say that no one knows anything about him, if you were to search for Steve Wells for the New York 22nd District, you will find that there is no information beyond 2016. He doesn't exist. That's because Mr. Steve Wells has never held an elected office. Mr. Steve Wells has been a volunteer for the New York GOP, a position that is not elected, and it does not require attendance, but he does make a lot of donations to many, many people. And as we mentioned, one of those people that he made a donation to was, of course, Andrew Cuomo, the now disgraced former governor of New York, who may be responsible for 16,000 people dying and a cover-up of those deaths during the COVID pandemic. So what do we know about Steve Wells? We know that Mark Weiner at the Syracuse.com, he thinks he's prominent, even though all evidence says he's not. We know that Mark Weiner says that this is going to change the race, and to an extent it does, because it introduces Mr. Wells again to the public. But who is Mr. Wells? Well, we actually know about Mr. Wells. We followed him in 2016, as well as all other candidates. We reported on what he was doing and how he was interacting with the public. Now that he wants to return to the elections and he wants to be elected again, we think it's fair to review where did he leave off with the public And what questions did he leave unanswered? We believe voters deserve to know these questions, and maybe this time, in 2022, 6 years later, they may get the answers finally. Now, one of the things we want to bring up, and you can go to the Voss Political Commentary, our site, where we were writing at the time instead of doing the videos. And we had covered a great deal of the race, and we did make comments. Now, this is from April 11th of 2016, and we were talking about Mr. Wells, and we were talking about his ads. Mr. Wells is not known for meeting with the public, as we will discuss in a moment. He's not into personal interactions with the public, but he did spend a lot of his money from his very successful business on ads and advertising. And we noted that he had put out an ad about the Second Amendment. In fact, his ad said, "We have a fundamental right to keep and bear arms, like if you agree." Well, we noted a couple of things about that ad that struck us as very odd. The first thing is that supporters of the Second Amendment already agree with the statement. So anyone agreeing with that isn't necessarily agreeing with Steve Wells or his candidacy, although it would look like he was getting that kind of support, that his candidacy was well received by the public, when it in fact is only being well received by people who believe in the Second Amendment. Also, very important, it was unclear that at the time, in 2016, with President Obama in place, having used executive orders to try to increase the amount of gun control laws in the nation, it wasn't clear if he was speaking about opposition to those executive orders. It also wasn't clear the gun control laws of New York State, in particular at that time, that would be the New York SAFE Act. Mr. Wells had never made a public statement about any of these things, and thus led to confusion amongst voters and a lack of clarity. We then asked him for an interview, which he declined, and we asked him to bring some clarity to his ad so that voters actually had an idea of what he was talking about and what he actually stands for. And so he changed his ad to then read, "We have a fundamental right to keep and bear arms. The Obama administration and liberal organizations have repeatedly advocated to removal of this right. It must be protected. Sign if you agree. Now, due to our actions in trying to get clarity for voters, Mr. Wells in 2016 updated his ad and made it clear where he actually stood so voters could evaluate him." We said at the time, "So I must conclude that the answer to what I asked on April 11th of 2016 is that this is an ad against the executive orders of President Obama and has nothing to do with the SAFE Act that Mr. Wells continues to be silent on. Nice to have some partial clarification that should honestly never have been needed to be clarified if the candidate wanted to let the public know where he stands. Since Mr. Wells or his staff are reading my posts and articles, please agree to an interview. In addition, could you please explain what will you do to protect the Second Amendment? You still have failed to tell the public that. And if you are reading this, keep in mind that there are many voters reading this too, as you know, since you changed your ad." Do you think that got a response from Mr. Wells? No. Did it get a response from Mr. Wells' staff? No. He ignored it. All right, let's go on. Because on May 10th, Steve Wells actually appeared in the city of Binghamton. And we were able to attend the event that he had. Now, this event, which presumably was inviting hundreds, if not thousands of individuals, that was at a public place, Mr. Wells declined the ability to have an interview. We notified Mr. Wells. We were there early at the event. It was stated to start at 5:30. We were there at 5:03. We asked for an interview with Mr. Wells, which he declined. We mentioned to Mr. Wells that we had been trying to reach him for an interview for 105 days at that time. He said he was unaware of it, and proceeded to pass us off to his staff, who refused to set a time for an interview. We then went on, and the event took place. Mr. Wells did not make a speech to the public. In fact, instead, he decided to speak with individuals individually on different subjects without letting anyone else know what he was actually saying to any one individual. He also avoided speaking with us directly, or even indirectly. After the event, we spoke to 15% of the 30 people that actually showed up. Again, thousands were apparently invited, 30 people showed up. 15% of the attendees that we spoke to, we were given the same response about the sum of Mr. Wells' conversations. We were told that Mr. Wells reiterated his campaign material, but failed to provide any answers of what he plans to do if he were elected. Further, Mr. Wells promoted his claim of being a political outsider, but he neglected to tell the attendees at this event that he made donations to Governor Andrew Cuomo, who opposes the Second Amendment that Mr. Wells claims he supports. His volunteer position, he also neglected to mention his volunteer position with the New York State GOP. And he also forgot to mention his influence with Republican candidates outside of Broome County, mostly through donations. Those we spoke with, who were unaware of Mr. Wells prior to the event, stated that they found his omissions to be curious. The event, by the way, did end early because half of the people at the event just left. But that wasn't the only other question that we had. So questions were piling up. Mr. Wells did not like to speak to the public, but he did want their votes. Mr. Wells was not being clear with the public on where he stood on many issues. Mr. Wells had no plan for what he would do if he were to be elected into Congress. Mr. Wells had no stance on the Second Amendment other than to say that he supported the Second Amendment. But we decided we needed to find out even more. And more importantly, Mr. Wells decided that he wanted to introduce questions himself. And so on May 17th of 2016, Mr. Wells appeared on WUTQ, which is a talk program, the Talk of the Town, a news program in the mornings in the Utica region of New York, in Oneida County. We are friends with that program, and we do support them. And we were listening to Mr. Wells as he spoke to the public. Now, Mr. Wells at the time decided to make a challenge, and he challenged the leading candidate, Claudia Tenney, who would later become Congresswoman Claudia Tenney, that we do know, and he questioned her on her attendance as a member of the New York State Assembly. Now, Mr. Wells has never been in an elected office. He has never made votes. He's never had to maintain an attendance at events. But he was holding that against Claudia Tenney because she had a record. We decided to look at the qualifications of these candidates, to compare the quantities, to be specific, to look at the number of years in elected office, the number of elections won or lost, the number of legislation proposed and or passed, and the number of public statements that can be found to the public. Now, again, Mr. Wells has none of those things. But we did go on because it isn't just about the quantity of things that are being presented to the public, but we also want to make sure that elections are about the quality of the candidate. And so we did want to address that and compare all of the candidates in 2016 on the same question so that there is an in-context comparison. Now, the thing that we found about Mr. Wells, when looking at this in this comparison of quality, of how he contacts other individuals, we noted equally, Steve Wells is almost without event in terms of having public events or public speaking activity. There is one YouTube speech that exists before the current run for Congress in 2016, but it addresses how youth should deal with superiors in the workplace and is non-political. Mr. Wells does have an extensive history of political donations that is public. These include donations to Democrats as well as Republicans, including donations to Governor Andrew Cuomo, who has led the charge against conservatives and Republicans in New York State, recently having said at that time that if you were a Republican or conservative, to leave New York State, as well as spearheading the New York SAFE Act, something that Governor Cuomo did over the night in 2013. There is no other public record demonstrating any political position that Mr. Wells maintains prior to his run for Congress. So on an apples-to-apples comparison, Mr. Wells wanted to be elevated compared to others who had done more than he had done, that he wanted to be considered a better candidate, but on an apples-to-apples comparison, he didn't have anything to offer, nor was he trying to show the public why he was the better candidate, just that he had more money and had more ads. Then we have our last item that we'll bring up at this moment, which was on June 22nd, just prior to the Republican primary that Mr. Wells ultimately lost. And we said at that time, Steve Wells was dodging constituent questions. Now, this is important because it involves Syracuse.com. Again, Syracuse.com made the announcement today that Mr. Wells is running. No other news media covered that. And it is the allegation or the statement by Syracuse.com and the author Mark Weiner that Mr. Wells is a prominent GOP candidate, which no other news media alleges, and there is no evidence of, as no documentation can be found. Even since 2016, he immediately and instantly stopped speaking. So on June 22nd of 2016, Syracuse.com provided a live chat for Mr. Wells to reach to the public. This was moderated by Mr. Mark Weiner, the same individual that made the article I just showed you, the same organization that published this announcement that no other media has. So there is a question about a conflict of interest, considering they were doing special activities just for Mr. Wells and now have special access to Mr. Wells that no other news media have. Going beyond that, there were 41 questions that were asked of Mr. Wells during this live chat in 2016. He answered 15 questions. 4 of the questions, 10%, were removed by Mark Weiner and just deleted. So he answered 15 of the 41 questions that were not deleted by Mark Weiner. The questions generally had a substance of, gee, you play skeet. Okay. Now, one of the questions he did answer, and was one of 7 questions that we had asked of Mr. Wells. So to be fair, after waiting an hour and being skipped until I started posting on Facebook, Mr. Wells answered my first question, the first of 7 questions that I asked during his event. Mr. Wells, you consistently state that you have an A rating with the NRA, but that is factually incorrect, as you have an AQ rating, as the NRA website shows, along with the endorsements of Claudia Tenney. Can you explain why you continue to misstate this in advertisements and debates? Mr. Wells responded, the reason for the NRA gives out the endorsement of AQ is because I am not a politician, unlike my opponents, meaning Claudia Tenney. I have not run for office before, nor has he run for an elected office since. Steve Wells goes on to say, I have the highest rating someone who has not held political office can get from the NRA, which is technically correct, but not quite. He goes on to say, I might point out to you that Assemblywoman Tenney, she was Assemblywoman at the time, now a Congresswoman, did not achieve an A+, which is the highest rating from the NRA that an elected official can receive. Now, something to point out about the NRA ratings, they're based on how you actually vote in reference to gun legislation and the Second Amendment. The AQ rating is a prediction, a guess based on political speeches that have been made by Steve Wells or other individuals, but it has no weight because it isn't backed up by an actual action from Mr. Wells. Now, I did follow up that question with another question. And I said, Mr. Wells, that doesn't answer the question that I asked, which is why is he misstating and misrepresenting the rating that he has from the NRA, which was factually incorrect. I go on to say, you do not have an A rating. Isn't this misleading? Doesn't it add confusion to the public to state you have a rating, a ranking, a value that individuals, say, who believe in the Second Amendment, who are members of the NRA, they would have some value in that. They would see that as being worthwhile or having some worth. And thus, in saying something that is untrue, it is factually incorrect. Well, and as he admitted, it is factually incorrect. Well, then he is misleading the public. We never received another response from Steve Wells. He declined to answer, and as we mentioned, Mark Weiner deleted several questions and limited the access of the public to Mr. Wells. So we have memories of Mr. Steve Wells, who wants to be a member of Congress again 6 years later after the last time that he felt like he should be a member of Congress. Mr. Wells is still a Republican. We believe he is still doing volunteer work for the GOP. He still continues to make donations. He's still a businessman. But the things that Mr. Wells is not is complete. He is yet to answer the questions that many voters had in 2016. He is still yet to speak to the public. He is still yet to make himself available to news media beyond Syracuse.com, who seem to have a very special relationship with him. And he has refused to speak with our organization, even though he is well aware of us. And we have spoken to Dr. Art Laffer and vice presidential candidates and many candidates for elected office at the local, state, and federal level for the last 15 years. So we do invite Mr. Wells to come on to answer the questions we were asking. What does he plan to do if elected to Congress? Where does he stand on the Second Amendment? And much of the legislation that has passed since the last time he was speaking to the public at all, such as the red flag laws and now the ghost gun laws as well. We have many questions for Mr. Wells, including in looking at his further donations that he has made since the time he walked away from the public on June 29th and never said another word. Mr. Wells is back at a confusing time, taking advantage of the confusion of many voters not knowing what district they're in or who they're voting for or who represents them. That's fine. That's his right. But we don't forget. We still remember, and we still have questions. Mr. Wells, we're still waiting for answers. If you have questions, please let us know. And we hope that you'll join us every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to have your voice heard in our live stream every week. We thank you, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.